I'm going to call the meeting to order. Clerk Spencer, please call the roll for our committee of the whole.
Peasant.
Here.
Gutenkopf.
Here.
Leader.
Here.
Dunn is absent. Graham.
Here.
Polumsky.
Here.
York.
Here.
Hipskin.
Here.
Healy.
Here.
Levin.
Here.
Kennedy.
Here.
Morley.
Here.
Wagner.
Here.
Mulliner.
Here.
13 present, 1 absent.
All right, we have a quorum, and we left off on, oh, I'm sorry. Did you get, I feel like we're in our third meeting, but this is the third opportunity for public forum if anyone wants to speak on this committee of the whole meeting. All right.
No one signed in.
No one signed in, Mr. Crumry. You have 3 minutes if you would state your name and address.
Michael Crumry, 570 West Crockett, and I just wanted to state that I agree that spending $3 million for a tunnel underneath a roadway to prevent 3 to 6 accidents is not a wise use of taxpayer funds. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, we will start on page 249 of your Think and Do book, and I think that we're starting with a TIF presentation and City Manager Grabowski.
Big glass.
Sugary drink.
Thank you again, Mayor. Appreciate that. A few weeks ago, we received a referral asking that city staff update the council on the existing TIFs, not only a history of how we got to where we are, but also reasonable scenarios with financial analysis and impact to the city, the school district, the park district, obviously all the other taxing bodies for each TIF district. Addressing at least the following: early termination of a TIF district, early release of any fully developed parcels within a TIF district, and we took it a couple steps further, looking at any surplus or status quo as well. So what I'm going to do, I am going to start with a little history for each one. I will go through that relatively quickly because I think everyone here is pretty familiar with it. In the audience, perhaps they are as well. Quickly again, the TIF overview. TIF is a financial incentive tool created by the Illinois State Legislature in 1978 to assist communities in implementing sound economic development. They can provide infrastructure and other public improvements. They can pay for consultant, engineering, attorney, and other applicable soft costs. TIF can be used to acquire property and prepare a site. And last, they can pay for other eligible costs pursuant to the law. Question that comes up is, when is TIF the right tool? Will the area benefit from the TIF designation, and what are the area's current condition or past history? It can be used in the situation where there's industrial projects that you would want to induce, commercial projects, including downtown areas, and then residential and mixed-use projects. To try to get to a basic explanation of how TIF works, we came up with this chart where the bottom gray cross-hatched area is the overall tax base of the area that you designate as a TIF. Basically draw the lines on a map. Once that plan is adopted, that tax base is frozen. From there on, any growth in that tax base goes into the TIF fund for redevelopment costs. Currently, Elmhurst has 4 TIF districts: the Central Business District, which was established in 1986, the Lake Street District, 1993, area at Route 83 and St. Charles Road in 1996, and most recently the North York TIF District, established in 2012. Here's a map of where the TIF districts are located. TIF 4 is kind of a faint blue at the very top. We asked that this be listed out so you could see the history of TIF 1 especially. It was established in 1986, amended in 2004, and extended at that point to 2021. Also, just of note, with TIF 1, we are also able to do a sales tax TIF, which is unique to that area. And Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, no longer... December 13. It expires in December 13, but are those allowed to be approved anymore? Does the state legislature does not allow those anymore, as I thought? This slide indicates an overall benefit of the TIF districts to the city. And when I say the city, I mean the TIF and the redevelopment of the areas. If I say the city, I don't mean that the increments coming to the city to be used in the general fund or in the capital projects. It goes directly to the TIF to benefit the TIF. So please understand that when I say that. Just from top to bottom, TIF 2, the fiscal year 12 property tax increment was $635,000, and overall we've received the TIF has received over $6 million. TIF 1, this year, the fiscal year 12 increment was $2.2 million with an overall cumulative increment of $30 million. TIF 3, this year, $437,000 with the cumulative increment of $3.9 million. So in total for this year, the TIFs receive about $3.3 million, and overall it's been $40 million. I think the designation and use and growth in these TIFs are a shining example of how TIFs should be used. This is a graph that indicates the growth in each of the TIF districts. Of note here is the pinkish line, I would call it, of second from the bottom, which is the overall city growth, and how the TIFs have performed significantly over that because of the inducements which we've done. And then the bottom line is just the commercial and industrial growth. And that was evident when we looked at the most recent TIF, the North York TIF, as to how these will benefit the city. Getting into specifics with TIF 1, this is a map indicating the completed projects. There's obviously numerous projects, and they range from new buildings, new commercial, to facade and building improvements that have benefited from the TIF dollars. As I mentioned before, TIF 1 was amended in 2004, and that was through an intergovernmental agreement with District 205. We released some properties from the TIF to the benefit of the taxing bodies, and as a result, we requested that the TIF would be extended 12 years for a total of 35 years. And we also were granted a 4-year extension on the sales tax TIF. And as it indicates, we released 9 parcels. And this map indicates which parcels have been released from the TIF since then, year by year, based on color. And then this is a very interesting graph, I thought, because it shows that we have released more than 50% of the value of TIF 1. If you look at the very bottom slide, the very bottom table, that's significant to the other taxing bodies, because once development has happened and can prove a benefit, the city has stepped to the plate and cooperated on that.
Can you go back to that previous slide and just talk a little bit about specifically the benefit that the other taxing bodies get when you say early release? How exactly is that a benefit to, say, 205?
All the taxing bodies benefit. The school district benefits the most because they're the highest tax rate on the tax bill. When we release a property that it was, just as an example, it was $1 when we froze it, it's $1 million when we release it, they are now able to apply their tax rate to all that growth. So they're benefiting from new tax dollars in that growth, which wouldn't have happened but for the TIF, but for the incentive that the city gave to the developer, or however it was done, whether it was public improvements, however that happened. The TIF is predicated on the idea that that growth will not happen without that help. So once that's released, all the taxing bodies are able to use that new growth to get new dollars into their tax base or spread their tax rate out over.
And that growth, the EAV is not bound by any cap. So the tax cap would only be on the rate. So if we release properties early, that just expands their base by that much, correct?
I would say yes. I'm not completely familiar with school funding to know how that affects new growth in the second year. Tom, I don't know if you can speak to that.
Yeah, the city manager Grabowski mentioned, the first year after it's released, it does get considered as new growth. So then all of the taxing agencies, especially the ones that are under the tax cap, can consider that new growth, and it does bump up their base. And then from then, it just CPI after that, but it does become part of the base.
But that, it's still bumped up to that higher level each successive year, and
Correct.
and then the CPI grows off of that new
Correct.
higher base.
Yep, correct.
Thank you.
So again, this is just another way of looking at the released properties and the tax rate applied to it, so you can see what benefit the taxing bodies have had in those released properties. Here we show the remaining properties and the increment generated according to most recent tax rate. The 2004 agreement included a provision, the make-whole provision, where each of the taxing bodies were to be made whole from money that they would have received had the TIF ended when it was originally supposed to in the 23 years. So to that end, starting in 2014, we are going to declare surplus from TIF 1 and continue through the end of the TIF. And these are in millions how much we are going to declare estimated each year based on EAV growth. And of that, the school district receives approximately 65 to 70% of each one of those dollar amounts. So we estimate a total of $15.5 million to be released in surplus. Future projects and obligations that we have with TIF 1 include streetscape improvements, other public improvements that we see from year to year, such as roadway improvements, the facade program that has been very popular, the retail business grants, which has also been very popular, and then we have about $4 million in debt service that needs to be paid off. On to TIF 2, map indicating of where it's at, and right on to projects completed within TIF 2. Significant more to the west side of the development area than the east side. Excuse me. Here we show what the revised EAV is and also the 2011 property tax increment generated by that. So close to $700,000 each year, at least for 2011, excuse me. Excuse me. If you look in the column, the first column, 2012-13, you see the $1.5 million in surplus that we'll be declaring from that, which is part of the IGA that we are negotiating with District 205. So significant in that. And then just to show you fund balances at the end of the year, balances, revenues, and expenses as we get to the end of the TIF, which is going to close in 2016. We have declared surplus from TIF 2 in the past. In 2004, we declared $734,000. In 2010, we declared $615,000, and as I said, in 2013, we're prepared to declare the $1.5 million surplus. Future projects in TIF 2 include potential public-private investments, which is developers coming to us with development ideas, infrastructure improvements, sewer, water, roadways, and then land acquisition possibilities for TIF 2. On to TIF 3, again located at Route 83 in St. Charles. and onto successful projects within that. This is an interesting TIF because it was project-specific when it was approved. Unlike the other two areas, which were just general development, this was project-specific, and that allowed us to enter into an agreement with all the taxing bodies to declare some distribution each year. Again, just before I get to that, the increment generated in 2011, $469,000. But this agreement with the taxing bodies has us declaring a certain amount of distribution each year. And as you can see in the middle column, that total has been $661,000 since 1996. Future projects and obligations include some land acquisition for that, and also some debt to the tune of $324,000. And again, here's the table that shows revenues, expenditures, any possible surpluses. And Tom, correct me, the 2015 surplus? Okay. So now we go on to TIF options, which is what the referral asked us to look at. And as I said, there were 4 options that we looked at. Early termination, early release of properties, surplus distribution, and status quo. So with TIF 1, we looked at early termination, and we have outstanding obligations and limits on any redevelopment opportunities, future projects. As I mentioned before, the facade program, the business development program, very popular and successful. So we would not recommend early termination, which leaves early release of developed properties, which we've done in the past. We know that could affect District 205 with their state aid calculation. There's legislation out there each year, it seems, that maybe would cap that or affect surplus, and that fades and grows each year. I have placed a call into the superintendent, asking him about which way the school district would lean on early release or any kind of surplus distribution. So I'm waiting for him to confer with his staff and get back to me on that one. Again, with also that obviously release of developed properties limits our increment and then limits redevelopment opportunities in future projects. Status quo, what we looked at, we already have the 2004 intergovernmental agreement, which guarantees the surpluses that we talked about earlier. And then it obviously maintains all the TIF advantages for development opportunities. So, again, here's the 2004 surplus declaration. On to TIF 2. Again, considering the 4 options, early termination, we still have outstanding obligations there and still limits redevelopment opportunities in future projects. Early release of developed properties, same as we talked about in TIF 1. There are properties that could be released from there, as well as there's surplus that could be determined from there if that's the policy that the council wants to adopt. And status quo allows maximum redevelopment opportunities, and surplus funds are distributed at the end of the TIF. Whether it's now or at 2016, the districts would be getting those funds if they go unused. And I guess I should kind of back up a little and say that when we look at a TIF from staff point of view, we look at it as what's the benefit of the TIF for the TIF district and the redevelopment. It's not that we are against the benefits that could be distributed out to the other taxing bodies, but we look at it purely from our staff standpoint of what's the benefit to the TIF in keeping it and keeping the funds here, and what can we do. So I just want to put that out there so that the council understands how we approach this.
Thank you. Just a quick question. I understand you have a call-in about state aid, but to clarify, would the school not Well, would a surplus distribution, it doesn't affect state aid? It's just only the early release or early termination?
I don't know the answer to that. That's why I'm asking.
Okay.
We've heard there's legislation out there, as an example, and this isn't the first time we've heard this, that would count any surplus against your state aid.
Okay.
And I don't know how much state aid District 205 receives, which is why I've asked them to analyze that and get back to us. But again, that's pending. There's nothing that's been approved. It's something that's thrown out each year, it seems. So here is kind of showing the TIF 2 boundaries in a developed and undeveloped sense, with the red portion being developed, the blue portion, for the most part, being undeveloped or not redeveloped, and just kind of breaks out the EAV, the increment, and any potential property tax increment that's generated from the two. Just so the council has an idea that the developed side is generating $486,000 per year, and the undeveloped area, which is a larger land area, is only generating $200,000. So we took this a step further and looked at surplus that could be released from this. And if you look at under expenditures, other expenditures, and surplus, in looking at the 1.5 that we plan to release this year, assuming that the IGA is approved. After that, it's conceivable that we could release $550,000, taking into consideration, thanks, Tom, taking into consideration other expenses that are out there. Again, as we did this year, it would be a deferral of projects, perhaps, or deferral of public improvements, deferral of any land acquisition. Certainly the positive side of declaring surplus is that at any point, if a project does come up, the city can hold that back, use that funds for whatever the project is, and then in the future continue with surplus. Moving on to TIF 3. Again, same list, just about the same replies with early termination. God bless you. Early termination, we still have some outstanding obligations, and it would limit any redevelopment opportunities, future projects. Looking at the early release or surplus distribution, it does limit us. Could we do it? Yes, we could. Again, policy decision by the council. And then status quo allows the maximum redevelopment opportunities such as land acquisition. Here is TIF 3 broken down by parcels. Kind of interesting to look at and how they're broken down and what they generate. You can see, for example, the Kmart site generates $125,000, which would be here. The Dominic's and Portillo's parcel generates $310,000, just as an example. Break that down, and we get into that a little bit further when we look at releasing any properties. What would we possibly want to do? That would be probably a key portion of this, which we could release, and it would generate approximately $310,000 estimated per year. So this is a similar chart as we looked at with TIF 2, where we get to the surplus line here. And it's, again, potential we could declare some surplus, taking into consideration our capital needs and our outstanding debt. It's conceivable we could generate that surplus into the conclusion of the TIF, which is 2019. Alternatively, this is one district that of the three where once the debt obligation is paid off, we could consider ending the TIF. This is kind of a tough one to read. I apologize for that. But if we were to look at the surplus distributions, which I mentioned, you start with TIF 1, which has already in the 2004 agreement has that distribution already declared. Then we look at TIF 2 and the distributions that I talked about into the end of the TIF, and then TIF 3. You can see that bottom line distributions of, in total, if we took them all the way out to the end of the TIFs, could be $20 million. And then we break that down by the school district and park district, because that was specifically asked for in the referral. The next slide will add the property tax that will be generated from these increments, again, assuming that the TIFs are taken out till their end, to the end year, to their expiration. You can see that number jumps to $26 million. And what I think this shows, again, is the success of all these TIF districts, and how in the long run, which is what we look at, in the long run, how they will benefit the taxing bodies and the taxpayers, because there's an opportunity for growing the pie, so to speak. And I'll go back to that one and let it sit and gladly answer any questions. But before that, I'd like to thank Marilyn and Tom and Mike Kopp for putting this together. Together, we put it together, and it was really appreciated.
Thank you, City Manager. Alderman Gutenkopf?
Thank you. I'd like to go back to TIF 1, and I, again, want to also thank you that this was really helpful to see this summary all at once. But if we could flip back to the TIF 1 slides, I have a couple questions because I'm not clear on why in some slides the SSA 6 and SSA 7 are included, and in some slides they're excluded. And I want to make sure I sort of understand what the point of that is.
Do you have a page number for the slide?
Oh, 7. Well, it's page 7, so it must be slide 14, and the ones before that. Here we go. Right in these slides, it's hard for me to see the screen. Yeah, so in some of these slides about TIF 1, you've incorporated SSA 6 and 7, and some you've excluded them. And I wonder if you could sort of explain how that impacts these financials.
I'm going to ask Tom to address the SSAs. He certainly understands that better than I think anyone else in the room.
On some of the slides, we talked about like fiscal year 11, 12, and those were out of the audit and stuff, some of our reporting. Part of the intergovernmental agreement, the 2004, we really have netted out the SSAs and stuff, so they haven't been part of it because of the pass-through dollars and stuff. And here we just showed it just to show the dollars involved, but we did highlight in the first area just the $1,897,000 is really what is part of our payback and stuff. So we tried to highlight it. We did just provide it as additional information.
So the intent was just to show us that how much SSA 6 and 7, because it's just a pass-through that these.
It is a
SSAs
pass-through,
are
so.
taxing themselves, so it's kind of beside the point when we're talking about what the TIFs are generating.
Well, it is generating that as revenue, but again, it is a pass-through. So again, in our budget, if you look at our budget, we do levy for the entire amount, and then the SSA pass-through is an expense. So we were just trying to provide it depending on what report that you go back to look at it, so.
Because when it comes to potentially releasing money to other taxing bodies, this isn't part of the conversation.
Correct.
Okay.
All right, other questions? Alderman Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. First, I also want to thank city staff. When Alderman York and Palumsky and I put this referral through, it was only a few weeks ago, and to turn it around this quickly and with the usual level of professionalism and information, I know I appreciate it. Thank you. For me, where this came from was really, there's been a lot of talk about TIFs lately, certainly with TIF 4, the IGA, with I hesitate to use the terms TIFs 5 and 6 that have been studied, those being on the shelf, people asking, are we going to do them? People saying, some on this dais saying that, we wouldn't consider another TIF unless we retired a TIF. I just thought it was important to get an understanding of what all of the various options were. so that as either we're thinking about this individually or talking about this in committee, as part of the IGA, what have you, that we have an understanding of what it means to shut down a TIF, or what it would mean to declare surplus, or what it would mean to release property early, and not just understand it from a terminology standpoint, but understand what it means from a hard dollar standpoint. So I appreciate that. And then also, the thing I was most pleased about is to hear the discussions at staff level with what works best for the schools. Because let's be honest, I think we all understand the difficulties that all school districts are facing, particularly not particularly, but certainly close to home 205. We understand the issues they're having, and to be able to have the discussions at staff level that, hey, what can we do to help, or what is best to help the schools if we choose to do something as a council. I think that's very beneficial, so I appreciate hearing that. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Alderman York?
Yeah, I'd like to also echo thanks on that. This is a great report, lots of details here. Certainly a lot of stuff that we kind of already knew, but it's good, I think, to get it out in the public and let the public take a look at it. And I'm not going to ask you to do it, but I think another important element of this too is if you were to take the TIF districts and then expand outside the TIF districts, I think you'd see that the TIF districts probably promoted some growth that wouldn't have otherwise occurred outside of those TIF districts. And I think the city's job is economic development. I think that the TIFs have allowed Elmhurst to do that in a very fine fashion, and I think it has spread outside the perimeters of the TIF and also increased the rate of economic development there in regards to EAV. So that's one thing I think people always need to keep in mind, and certainly something that I've brought up several times in our TIF 4 discussions is I think that we need to have that happen up in the north too. So another important element that I think really needs to be considered. Thank you.
Other questions or comments? Alderman Palumsky?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also want to say thank you. I appreciate this information. There's a lot to consider here, and I would agree with Alderman Healy with the importance of taking a look at this and getting a better idea of what's best for the community as a whole, including the school. So I think this is very helpful, and for me, this is something I'd started thinking about. I think everybody has may have a different reason for wanting to take a look at this, and I thought with the implementation of TIF 4, started to think about, well, when do we revisit this? At what point do we look at the others? And do we stay on track, or do we take a look at what we could do? So I appreciate the option to consider. Thank you.
I have a question or comment myself, and I note that TIF 2 seems, well, let me put it the other way around. TIF 1 has done so much, and TIF 3 seems like there's not too much more to be done there, but TIF 2, by even the chart where we showed how much was pink versus how much was blue, would suggest there's quite a bit more to be done. Yet I see that's probably that's the next expiring TIF. Are there projects that are in the hopper for that TIF 2 right now?
We've been talking to some developers in the area and trying to set the stage for the future in parcel consolidation. But there's nothing that's imminent, unfortunately, where somebody said, I'm going to build a building next year, next month. But we're looking at some land acquisition opportunities there to see if there's some consolidation that can happen to encourage that.
It's not a very popular question, but I'm just wondering if staff has looked at whether this can all be accomplished before the end of the TIF term.
The linchpin in that is the property owners and whether they're willing to sell or not. So I guess I can't answer that, not knowing exactly how the property owners feel about that.
Okay, thank you. All right. Anything else on the TIF presentation? Then, City Manager, do you have anything else on that?
Unless there's questions about the actual budget.
Okay, well, let's look at our budget book, which would be page 249. on TIF funds. So if there's any specific questions, I think we've had a pretty good overview here, but this would be the time to ask questions about any of the, I'll start with TIF 1. Let's see where this is going. Any of the TIFs, we'll just say. 1 through 4. All right. Then we'll move on from the TIF funds to the capital improvement fund, which is on page 181 of the budget book. And, you know, Marilyn, I'm just going to ask this because although I'm on the Finance Committee, I think this is, for my years on the council, I think you get to a certain level of comfort with the operating budget. And the magic of all the capital budgets, I think, is something that I could probably get a little deeper into myself. But this capital improvement fund, this fund is collecting funds to be distributed to other capital funds, is that correct?
Yes, that essentially is correct, that by policy, the council has indicated that dollars are put into this fund, and those dollars are 1/3 of our home rule sales tax. 80% of income tax,
Right.
and 25% of the electric utility tax go in here as the primary sources of revenue, and then as we go through our capital plan, the council decides how we distribute those dollars back to pay for capital projects over time. And those are generally capital projects or debt service relating to the general fund. It would not be those projects that would otherwise be paid for either by a TIF fund or by the municipal utility fund, water and sewer projects.
So the funds we see on page 185, where their uses are, we're going to see these same numbers appear in other funds on lines 9801, 9817, 37, and 39. We're going to pick those up as we look at the other funds. Is that correct?
In total, that's what we indicate we are transferring to those funds, either for debt service or for projects. And you won't necessarily see those on one line item in the other funds, because you'll see projects all through the general fund that will add up to this, you know, the 4.28 million.
All right. Any other questions? Alderman York?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Can you remind us on the grants portion on page 183, the grants, the $600,000 grant that was budgeted for this year, but it's moving over to the next budget year? What was that for again?
I'm going to ask Tom Trozine to remind you
Okay.
of what that was.
What line item are you on?
Page 183, the grants, it's right in the middle of the page,
Very good.
600,000.
Thank you.
Yeah, those are 4 capital bill grants that we received from the state of Illinois. We've received paperwork on 3 of them, and we're waiting for the 4th. And most of those projects have actually already been completed. So once we get the paperwork back from the state, hopefully we'll submit them and receive it. But we didn't think that we would get it this year.
Are
So
they
again,
roadway or different?
Roadway, I think there was part of West Avenue project was
Oh,
one
the
of
sidewalk.
them. Actually, Spring Road, I think, project was one of them that's been completed for now 2 years and stuff. So this is really just a delay in funding from the state, but it's the capital bill related.
Okay.
So all roadway projects.
Yeah, I remember,
Please.
I remember, I think it was last year where we actually picked up some grant money from a prior year, so this is just kind of trying to account for that then.
This is actually additional than the other 2.
Okay.
So these are additional grants besides the other 2, that there was a timing on the other 2 as far as the expenses not matching up with the revenues.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And anyone else? I don't think it's in here yet, but because somewhere along here, I know Alderman Bram asked about it, I think there's the York Underpass project, which is getting a lot of discussion, but I think, City Manager, we were at the DuPage Mayor and Managers Association. They announced that they had approved a grant to the city if we elected to proceed with that project. Do you remember what the amount of the grant was? Was it like 2 million?
1.6.
1.6, 1.7? All right, and that's not showing up in the budget yet. They're holding it for future years. Okay. All right. If nothing else on the Capital Improvement Fund, we will move now to the Capital Project funds, which are starting on page 272. And Marilyn, do you want to do an overview of these? I think that'd be helpful.
Most of these are, most of these are the funds that capture bond proceeds. The bond proceeds will be accounted for in here and then distributed from these funds to whatever fund is actually using the bond proceeds. The exception to that is on page 281, which is our stormwater fund. And that fund captures costs specifically for stormwater. They come in the form of fee in lieu of funds. You can also see the beginning clear out in 2014, about on the middle of the page on 280, that we're looking at capital. We don't know what that is yet, but we know it's coming. So we have that in the capital plan over a couple of years, about $7 million. And you'll see also other financing sources, transfers in, and that would be bond issue dollars to pay for those stormwater activities that are yet to be identified.
Alderman York?
Thank you, Your Honor. On page 274, under the GO bonds, there's a premium on long-term debt, figure of $90,000. Could you explain the origination of that? Is that due to discounting of bonds when they were purchased, or?
Sure. Yeah, these are the most recent issue, the 2012 bonds. And yes, I believe you are correct that that's a premium paid at the time of issuance.
On page 277, actually the 2014 series fund, are these the ones where we've gone out already in advance to get these funds, or?
No, we have not. This is a projected bond issue in the 2014. This $7 million issue was designated in our projections for the stormwater activities.
And we show, just so everyone's following this, we're showing that $3 million is then being transferred out to the stormwater fund. Is the other $4 million, is that being reserved for future stormwater or for other purposes?
Also for future stormwater. We have $7 million out there in projects yet to be identified and a $7 million bond issue to pay for those. We're just showing that in 1 year that we would be transferring out, or we would have $3 million in projects, and probably the next year we would be spending the remaining $4 million.
And if for some reason there was a decision not to use that other $4 million for stormwater, and I'm not saying there is or isn't, but those funds would be available for other capital projects.
Right,
All right.
right.
All right, any other questions on our capital project funds? Alderman Bram?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. On page 281, the Stormwater Fund, I believe years ago when York High School was built, there is a waiver given to the school district on the county restrictions for stormwater, and I believe that was in lieu of $1 million. Is that reflected in here? And if not, why not?
The city has not received the fee in lieu of fee from the school district.
Follow-up? Is there any plan to do so, or what is the current, I guess, agreement with the school district on those funds?
The current status is that it's been brought to their attention on a number of occasions. Superintendent's aware of it. As we begin discussions for property use, school property use for storm detention projects, it was my intent to bring it up at that point to see where it stands as far as collection or fee in lieu of using facilities, property, things like that.
I guess the only question I would have would be, and that would be an option, would be, we've been talking about the IGA for a long time now. That, at least from my standpoint, that would have been something that should have been considered and brought up as well. I think the school has been built for, I don't know, around 5 years. I don't even know anymore. More or less.
I would say longer than that.
Has it been longer?
Yeah.
I haven't been to high school in a while, so I don't know.
Yeah.
But in any case, I think that is something that we need to follow up with the school district on, no matter if it is in regards to stormwater management issues or actually collecting the $1 million that is owed to us.
I would just add that in terms of the IGA, it was complex enough going through the language over the last couple of months. I think that would have derailed it to about graduation time of 2016 before we would get that through, but I understand the question you raise. All right.
May I just add one
Yes.
thing on that? On the city side, we do show that as a receivable on our balance sheet. We don't go over the balance sheet when we're sitting here, but it's there, it's a receivable, our auditors know about it, so that I'm sure it couldn't be forgotten, but it can't be forgotten because it's recorded on our books, and the school district knows that it's recorded on our books as a receivable.
Understood. Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? All right, I think that concludes the capital project funds. We're going to go to page 285, bond and interest funds.
The bond and interest funds are needed because GASB says that we need to have separate bond and interest funds in some cases for our governmental funds to capture the dollars that are used to pay for the debt service on an annual basis. So in here you will see the the current portion of our long-term debt service that is to be paid every year. From various funds. It just gets funneled through one fund, and then the debt is paid.
And those funds are all listed on page 287, where we're collecting it to pay the interest related to those obligations.
Right.
Any questions? All right. Then we'll move on to page 293, trust and agency funds.
By definition, trust and agency funds are funds where the city either accounts for or holds money for some other purpose. For instance, the police and firefighters pension fund are not city funds, but the city does the accounting for them, and they are part of the city's audit. Let's see. The other trust and agency, the Gloss Mausoleum, that's a fund that the proceeds of that fund can be used only for the upkeep of the Gloss Mausoleum. We budget small amounts in there. Usually, it's been maybe 5-6 years ago that there was a complete cleaning and upgrade and lighting for that, for the mausoleum. when that's planned again, you'll see those dollars used, but small dollars every year. Important to note, the next one, the working cash fund. There, I'd like to point out on page 305 that if you look out in the 2014 year, you'll see the fifth payment, the fifth repayment of the loan from the general fund, which brings that fund back up to $1 million. And that, then it's at its goal. Any dollars over $1 million then are automatically transferred to the general fund, but then $1 million is in there for when it's needed again. Hopefully not soon.
Alderman Healy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Is there something magical about the $1 million number? Is that 3 months, cash on hand, or is it just $1 million that's?
I would say there wasn't anything magical at the point that the Finance Committee a few years ago reviewed that policy and sort of updated it. They said this was a number that made sense to them, that it would be no more than $1 million and hopefully no less than $800,000.
And is it fair to characterize that as a rainy day fund? If something really big,
Sure.
bad happens, we've got $1 million
Yes.
set aside in a cash fund that we can call on quickly should we ever need it, God forbid.
Right.
Thank you.
That's exactly it.
I think the Finance Committee did a good piece of work there. I think Alderman York got it started in terms of getting discussion going to start making sure that got paid back after the woes of 2009. All right, any other questions on these funds? All right, General Revenue Fund is a good news fund on page 102. City Manager.
My only comments here would be that this was taken to the Finance Committee for review as part of the budget, and we would open it up for questions if anybody has any.
I think there's an interesting comment is that if you look at their chart, which we've been looking at for the last, since 2009 at least, on page 99, you can see the dip down where we were below. This is, Alderman Healy, is our our multiple months of balance here, 3 or 4 months, and now we see that it's projected that as we go into the next 2 years that we're actually going to be above, at the high end of the range, we're there. Questions on general fund? I actually had one myself, and since I'm on Finance Committee, I'll probably have to say, oh yeah, that's right. But under intergovernmental, I could not remember why the number was changing so differently between the annualized basis, what we were doing in,
What page?
I'm sorry, 98, under revenues. I mean, we were about $1.5 million, $1.6 million, then we had a big bump up to 5.296 estimated, and I thought there was some sort of. In the wrong page. Yeah.
General government? Mayor?
Page 98, under revenues, intergovernmental.
Fifth line down.
Okay. Is that because of grant? I don't think it's because of grant. Gotta go.
It's more of an informational item if you want to.
Yeah, sorry, it's not a number that we're finding we can easily tie out, but in that intergovernmental line, the reason it's going up and down so much is that it includes grants from the state. The intergovernmental is not within the city, it's what's coming from the state. So on that line, included in the intergovernmental are income tax coming from the state distributions and the grants. And so that's just going to cause a fluctuation.
Well, the income tax is fairly stable,
In-
but so
in-
it's a
income
difference in
tax would-
grants, all right.
It would be fairly stable. It's really the grant income that is going to fluctuate from year to year.
Like from the garage, right? The Metro money came through there too?
Yeah.
And no, I'm sorry, that would have been in the parking system fund. But the hospital project, where we've received repayment from those types of projects, reimbursements from the state for road projects, things of that nature.
Okay. Any other questions on general fund? All right, we're on to capital expenditure budget, which is in your capital expenditure budget, pay the whole thing, I guess, and since the agenda was amended late, I didn't bring that portion with, so I don't have my question or two. But oh, I keep it in a separate book, but thank you. You won't have my questions in here, though.
It's all facing it, basically.
Thank you. Any questions on the capital expenditure budget? Marilyn, did you want to make any comment on it in particular?
You know, the capital expenditure budget is one we delivered to the council in December. We do an overview of it in January, and the first 2 years of the 5-year capital are in the operating budget. So they are already part of the budget that you see. And I would say the only one that changed from what you see here in this 5-year plan and what became part of the capital budget is the Prairie Path Underpass project. And that you see on page 10 of the CAB, about middle of the page, number 38.
Page 10 of the cap.
Alderman Bram.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm not going to go in depth from the standpoint of what I've already expressed my concerns when we talked about this, when we were given the overview of the capital budget, what seems to be months ago, but probably only a few weeks ago. I think that to see such a large project kicked off, a roughly $3.2 million project estimated to be kicked off this year without any full city council discussion is not the right way to go. I've expressed that passionately last time this topic was brought up. One of the residents spoke tonight, Tamara Brenner, and she actually stole my thunder from the standpoint of the points that I want to make, so I'm not going to reiterate it from the council. I assume everybody was listening to her comments. I think that even starting off in the basic engineering work being, I think it's estimated for this budget cycle of $235,000 is, no? I see Marilyn shaking your head.
Well, that's what, I'm sorry I didn't complete my sentence before, that's the only item that did not go directly as it was presented in the 5-year capital. It was changed when it went to the 2-year. In the first year, in the short year 2013, there are no dollars allocated to that project. In the new calendar year, new fiscal year 2014, there is $150,000, and that is just phase 1 engineering. So the project has been moved out considerably. It is not in current year activity, nor is it in the 2013 activity.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. It still doesn't, I guess, negate the point that I was about to make. I think that even before we budgeted at all in the capital expenditure budget, I think we need to have the discussion first if it's a viable project. Over the past few meetings, people have spoken against it. I know there's been comments directly to me against it, and I'm not saying for or against it because I know nothing about it other than what I read in the grant application. The grant application actually does state that we were looking for a request of $1.642 million STP request. And we actually have, or had, I don't know if it's current anymore, but according to my budget book, a grant of $1.76 million, which is above even what the grant application states. I think there's many concerns that I have before we move forward with this. So I don't know if it's the city attorney's not here. I don't know if it's the appropriate time, but I would like to make a motion to actually strike this project out of the capital budget altogether until this full city council gets to at least debate this openly and publicly. So I guess I look to my parliamentarian to state if this is the appropriate time to make that type of a motion.
Well, is there going to be a second? Alderman Pezza. I think it is the appropriate time. Without comment, City Manager.
Thank you. What I would add to what Director Gaston commented was that within a meeting or two after the KEB was presented to the council, the Public Works Committee talked about this item, and it was the consensus of that committee to push it further out and not apply for the CMAQ funds in the current year because of the Phase 1 engineering, but to push it out so that we would have the engineering dollar, or we would have the budgeted dollars in 2014 if we chose to go that route, and then to further discuss it, the project, as we move forward. I'll just add that.
I think the intent that we had was that it was going to be going to committee, and I know that, I don't know on this one, but when you want to apply for a grant and hold a space, that you need to show in your budget that you are committed to it. It doesn't mean you can't say no later, but it says now that we're just making a commitment that we're going to be looking down that road. I don't know that anyone has reached a conclusion that I've talked to on the council that we're doing it or not. Alderman Bram.
Thank you. If it was discussed in the committee, and I do recall the meeting minutes from the committee, but once again, I saw no official report or recommendation from the committee, and I think that's proper procedure to come back with that discussion to the full city council, for the full city council to actually vote on if it should or should not be moved out of the current budget year. I was under the impression, since it was only stated in the meeting minutes, that therefore, as a committee of the whole, then if anyone so choose, which I just did, to make the motion to either modify or change this. I have a budget document here that shows dollars, and I understand I was corrected this evening, a few minutes ago, but shows dollars, and this is the information I go on, of having monies allocated this current fiscal year that we're going to eventually make a motion to pass the full budget. I don't understand procedurally on how we could make a correction on such a large project without seeing this go through committee and therefore the full committee of the whole make some type of decision. If it's not through the committee/council process, then it should be taken care of through the committee of the whole budget process. One of those two deemed to be needs to be necessary, because every single elected official should be discussing this point publicly, where they stand on allocating, even though it's a little portion this or next fiscal year, as I stand corrected, on such a large project, especially when it comes to capital, when $3.2 million, and I understand that whomever found an additional $1.4 million somewhere to provide for this project, which is great, but some of these dollars could be spent on infrastructure projects that we as a full city have concerns over: stormwater management, sanitary management, and I can go on, street conditions, etc. I know I hear all three of those complaints in my ward. So procedurally, either we need to have a report, or we need to actually publicly discuss this tonight and make that decision on what we should do with it.
Alderman Healy, and then Alderman Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The last time this was discussed, it was Alderman Bram and myself that went back and forth. I, in fact, referred to it as a game of ping pong and let the game continue. I'm not going to speak to the merits of the project. I think everybody here knows how I feel about it. But I will speak to the procedure of the project because I believe some of what's been said here on the dais and what has been said publicly is incorrect. First of all, this project has followed exactly the process that's supposed to happen. Exactly. Because if we're going to change the process now so that the city council reviews every project before it goes into the budget, there are literally dozens of projects in this budget that we need to yank out and then discuss before staff puts them back into the budget. The budgeting process is fairly simple. Staff presents the 5-year capital expenditure budget. They did that. Council voiced a concern about the Prairie Path underpass. We discussed it in the Public Works Committee. As a result of that, staff, during the budgeting process, decided to hold off a year on the Prairie Path York Road underpass. That's exactly what is supposed to happen. That is the process. That's the way things are done. Now, specifically about the project, yes, it's a $3 million project, but at this point, we know we already have $1.75 million in grant money. That knocks the city of Elmhurst costs down dramatically. We believe that there's another $400,000 in CMAQ grant funding available. Don't have it yet, but we think it's going to be there. That further knocks down the dollar figure. So we can run around and say $3 million all we want, it's just not accurate. Back to the process, I will vote against the motion. This project will continue on the path. If it stays in the budget, it will go before committee, the Public Works Committee. If it makes it out of committee with a majority, we will vote on it at council. If we approve it, it will go to bid, like every other project we do. I don't understand what the problem is. You may not like the project. I get it. I understand it. I disagree. That's what this is all about. But the process itself is not a problem here. I, for one, do not want to start telling staff, before you start chasing down every grant, check with the council. Before you put something into the budget, check with the council. That is not how it's done in the past. That is, I don't think, how we want to do it in the future. I want staff tracking down every grant they can for whatever purpose. We cannot just use the $1.75 million that in STP funds to do whatever we want. We can't go grade roads with them. We can't do stormwater with them. We have to use them for this project, should we choose to move forward with the project. I agreed with the delay. I think it gives us more time to figure out if this project has stormwater implications. Staff has already discussed that once. We need to explore the traffic safety, because I, for one, am not willing to just say, 3 accidents, 6 accidents. Not going to do it. If this were in any of our neighborhoods, if this intersection were in any of our neighborhoods, those aldermen would be standing on the dais, screaming. I'm not just going to dismiss that. We may not do this project, and if we choose not to do the project, we will do it through normal process. Thank you.
Alderman Kennedy, then Alderman Pezza.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't rehash what Alderman Healy said, but in the last 3 years, we've done exactly what Alderman Healy has said from a standpoint of reviewing capital projects. We get the first document, we bring it back to Public Works, we ask questions amongst ourselves. In this case, we decided we would put this out, and as staff was presenting here tonight, talking about taking what we had thought we were going to spend money next year and putting it into the following year. So we've done it exactly the way we always have. We've done it the right way, and no decisions have been made, to Alderman Healy's point. We're going to bring this to committee. We're going to review it, and I think we're all going to have our own opinions about the merits of the project from a safety standpoint. one of my thoughts, and it's been bandied about a little bit, is that there might be a potential stormwater benefit from this. There's an area at Seminole, at Parkside, and Prospect, if I recall, is one of the targeted areas. There may be a potential that those two issues can be put in together with one solution. Nothing's been talked about, but I'm certainly not going to take an option off the table right now of something we're not going to build probably for 3 or 4 years. So I'm not going to be in support of the motion. I think the project stays, and it's a good one to look at going forward. Thank you.
Alderman Pezza, then Alderman Bram.
Thank you, Mayor. I agree with Alderman Healy that this is our budget process. However, there's also something called a public process and a political process. And unfortunately, I think all three of those are being mixed into this equation. And when I see that back in June, I received all the documents from the DuPage mayors and managers. And this has been going on since last June, unbeknownst to many of the council members. Some, I guess, were kept informed, but I don't think that's a fair public process. That might be a political process, but that's not a fair public process for some people to be informed and others not. Then all of a sudden, this all goes back and forth. We've got these letters that this body approved it, the body saying they didn't approve it. We've got all this stuff mixed together, and it equals $3-some million. Whether or not the money was awarded or it's reserved, that's not even an issue for me. The issue is, once again, here we go, bypassing the public process, using a political process through the budget process to get this pushed through. I guess the most common word I've heard in response from the people that'll be paying for the rest of this project is ridiculous and wasteful. I can't support putting a ridiculous and wasteful project that never went through the public process and has been a political issue into a budget for 2015, maybe in 2014, if it's gone through the process and the people think it's a great idea, put it back in on the next budget cycle. The money's sitting there. The fellow from the mayors and managers said they'll keep it for 20 years if they have to. There's really not a time limit on it. They'll keep it for a long time. So it does not need to be in here. If the public wants it, next year, put it back in for 15, 16, 17, whatever the public chooses. So I support the motion.
Alderman Bram, then Alderman Gutenkopf.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Like I said before, I don't want to talk about the merits of the project. I don't know any of the details of the project other than the research that I have done, which maybe many of my colleagues have not done already, so it wouldn't be right and it would be out of order to discuss the merits of the project itself. I would encourage others to not do that as well. I agree with Alderman Healy's statement from the standpoint of the money that has been promised to us, the grant money, cannot be allocated to any other projects because we applied for this particular project. So we either use it or lose it. Whenever we decide that, that is what's going to happen. In regards to have we followed the process, here I will disagree with Alderman Healy's comments. We have not, because never in the past did I see all of a sudden a project, especially this large, but never a project, dropped in the fiscal year that we're debating without seeing it a couple years in advance, and then it comes before us. It's always planned in the future. It's never dropped that same fiscal year, especially in this case where it's so large, so many funds, as well as finding out, as Alderman Pezza stated, that this was being discussed for at least 8 months or 6 to 8 months before the full city council found out about it. So I don't think that piece of the process was followed. And the other piece that I would like to respectfully disagree with on previous comments is about how we are going about modifying the budget. Anytime the budget is supplied to us, and if we so deem necessary to make any changes, we make a motion. If it is seconded, then the full council, the committee of the whole, votes on that one way or another. That is the way it's been done. We've done it in previous years. This full city council has done it that way in previous years. I think it was 2 years ago, I made the motion to remove laptops for the aldermen, and that actually went through 2 years ago. That's the way we've done the process. The statement that I made earlier is true. It either has to come as a recommendation from a committee and it gets voted on by the full city council, or we make a motion here during the budget cycle and it gets voted on. That is the process. So I think those two steps, if we don't follow either of those steps, it hasn't been followed. We need to follow those. The motion's in place, so we're following that step now. It is not up for debate, but the other step should have been done. It should have never been budgeted for this fiscal year, never. So I think that we need to pretty much move forward with what we would like to do if we would like to remove this from the budget cycle. As I've heard before on the dais from many of my colleagues, it's only a plan, right? So if the budget's only a plan, and if discussion moves forward, then we can put it in next year for 2015 or 16 or 17. So I don't see what the problem is with removing this line item out of the budget tonight. I haven't heard any arguments that would negate the project as a whole. This is removing a current line item out of a plan that could be added in the next fiscal year.
Alderman Gudenkauf?
A couple of thoughts. My first thought is that I am quite frustrated as a member of the Public Works and Buildings Committee to see a project that was proposed months before we received the capital budget that hadn't come before this committee. And I'm very disturbed that it had been so fully formed, and the other members of the committee clearly knew about it, but the committee never discussed it, because I think that would have been an appropriate way to address whether or not it should have been in the capital budget for this year. Had the committee had the opportunity to discuss it when the grant went in and became part of our overall planning, perhaps we wouldn't have this discussion tonight. The other thought I have is that as a committee, we have already determined that the 2013 fiscal year, the one that we're talking about, the 8-month fiscal year, is not going to see any proposed expenditures for this project. The budget we're approving now is simply for that 8-month fiscal year. So I just want to make sure I understand the real issue and get the pieces lined out, because I've heard a couple of different things. So even though the printed capital budget in front of us came out before the committee decided to postpone this, it's going to show up in this paper, but it shouldn't be showing up in the rest of the budget book. Is that correct? So the committee has decided that this year, fiscal year 2013, the 8-month fiscal year, if we're not going to be spending or approaching this project, it shouldn't have been carried forward in any of the Public Works budget. So it doesn't show up there. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
There are no expenditures for this in the 2013 budget.
So the very baseline that we're being asked to approve tonight does not include this project. So that brings us to the second part of what we've been discussing tonight, and that's where I think this real argument is should we be discussing this at all? Because on one hand, we project out 5 years, things that we expect we might be spending. And if we expect we might be spending this money, the only way for us to really look forward and plan for that funding is to get it in our long-range capital expenditure budget. Typically, when we have things in our long-range capital expenditure budget, we have long-range discussions about whether or not they have merit. And as they roll in to the yearly budget, we vet them. The laptops is a great example of something we did that for. Now, whether or not I think this project should go forward is a different issue than the procedural issue that I think underlies all of this. Now that we know about this project, and now that it's come before the Public Works and Buildings Committee, we've started to discuss it. We can't discuss the pros and cons of this project without having an understanding of what it's going to cost the city to build it. So I'm inclined not to modify the rest of the document because the 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017 pieces of this expenditure kind of have to be laid out so we know what we're going to take, what we're going to be spending the money on and when. I still think this project needs massive vetting because I'm deeply disturbed that there was no public discussion about this by this committee before it got to this point. But if we've already taken it out of the 2013 budget, that's what we're being asked to approve tonight. And the discussion about whether it shows up in the 2014, 2015, 2016 projections is a different issue.
Alderman Healy, then Alderman Morley.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, for the, not the first time, but one of the few times tonight I agree with something Alderman Pez has said. This is a 100% political process. There's a few aldermen that really strenuously object to this process, so they're fighting against it. I can respect that, but they're doing it in a unique way. It's a public process. It's public. This is exactly, and I'll stand by my comments, this has exactly followed procedure. We do not discuss projects before they go into the budget. They go into the budget, then we discuss them. That gets approved by the budget, goes through the committee process, it's bid, et cetera. That's what happens. That's what happens with the north or the West Avenue sidewalks and railroad improvements. I didn't know about that until it got into the budget. I'm suspecting most of us on the dais didn't know. But it was in the budget, it was approved, it went through committee, committee approved it, went to the council, council approved it, it was same thing here. But we keep hearing the word public process, public process. I wonder why they're doing that. This followed the process. If you don't like the project, fine. Don't assail the process. Don't assail city staff. Don't tell them, don't go for grants until we tell you to go for grants. That's what's happening.
Alderman Morley?
I just need, I want clarification on the motion. Just to make sure I understand it, and then I would ask the chair a question. Is the motion to strike on CEB 10, page 38 in this case, the line item, is the motion to strike that entire thing out of the budget or just remove $235,000 from calendar year 2013?
Well, let me ask for a clarification on your request for clarification. Is that $235,000 after Public Works Committee, is that remaining in there? Or are we looking at a page that doesn't really reflect what we're trying to put through anyway? In other words, is the $235,000 really, if we adopt this capital budget, it's not supposed to be there anyway?
Right. Essentially, since we sent the KEB to the council, that page has changed.
Okay, so Alderman Morley, I think if you looked at this page and put a piece of ink across 235, that's how it exists today, and Alderman Graham is seeking to move the entire line, or I'll let you speak to what I thought your motion was.
Yes, Mr. Mayor. My motion is to remove the entire line item out of the budget this year.
So for clarification, if you all cross the 235 out of your budget book, that's the proposal, or no?
As a point of clarification, you're asking to remove it from the KEB, the capital expenditure budget? The entire project.
Right. Alderman Bram is seeking to remove line 38. But I just want to clarify that as it stands before his motion, that 235 under 2013 is not supposed to be there.
That is correct.
All right. Alderman Bram?
I go back to my previous statements that a committee on its own, cannot make a decision to change a line item when the full city council has reviewed that for discussion as committee of the whole. If my motion does not pass, then it should go back to what is printed on CEB 10, line 38, which is the 235 for this fiscal year. If the committee as a whole, or sorry, the council as a
Well,
whole.
Alderman Bram, I think Alderman Morley had the floor. We can come back to you, but I think he just wanted clarification on what,
Okay.
where you were, if you indulge me on that. Alderman Morley.
Well, for the record, it's not clear at all. My question is, am I looking at an old budget sheet? Should I be looking at a sheet that has a 0 in 13?
Which page are you looking at?
CEB 10, line 38.
CEB 10,
Yes, there's a 0 on line.
line 38.
There's a 235.
There's the two, I crossed it out because the mayor told me to. Now I can't even read it.
235.
235.
As far as the 235 goes, that is now, in the operating budget, that is a 0.
Okay. In the capital budget, it's still printed as 235.
In the capital planning document, which is
Yes,
what it is.
yes, this capital expenditure budget according to this.
And that was handed out
I understand.
with that intention, after hearing council discussion, committee discussion. The operating budget reflects 0 for this year.
I understand what the operating budget
Well,
reflects.
I think what we're going to put together so we can get through this is Alderman Bram is pointing out that no one's amended this budget. So for our discussion purposes, I suppose that if Alderman Bram's motion fails, if it passes, the entire line 38 is wiped out. If it fails, then it'd be appropriate to look at removing 235 from the capital budget because we're not going to use it this year. Is that correct?
We're, you know, when, I'm sorry, Alderman Mulliner.
Alderman Morley.
To clarify, it sounds like the motion, the clarification of the motion, is to strike the entire line item.
Correct.
It sounds like city staff is saying that we're looking at a budget that should be a 0, and maybe we can make it a 0 later on in this process. My final point of clarification is, we're not being asked to approve anything tonight, is that correct?
Well, it's not final approval. That's correct.
I just want to clarify that point.
All right, let's see where we are. I think we're on Alderman Mulliner, and we'll take it from there.
Okay, let's all take a deep breath here for a second, okay? Deep breath time. The 5-year budget, it's called a 5-year budget, but it's a planning document. The actual budget itself is the other components that we deal with. So yes, we do need to modify no matter what before we actually approve the budget. Not an uncommon process. I agree with Alderman Healy that the process that we've gone through is correct. The staff has done what they're supposed to do. We may not all agree with the project, okay? I don't necessarily agree with the project, but the process has been correct. Before the budget is finally approved, what will happen is staff will go back and make necessary modifications to any pages that we've modified. The modification was made in a committee. Now we do need to put an amendment on the floor to modify that to a 0 on the planning document. However, it's already been changed in the actual budget. So it's actually at 0 in the budget for next year. So the bottom line is nothing's happening next year, and we're going to have a year to evaluate whether or not we think this is an appropriate budget or not. Now, Marilyn can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's where I'm at with it.
Director Gaston.
There have been times in the past that the CEB has said one thing. It comes out in December. It's discussed early in January. Things change. We see, ooh, we don't have enough money to do this. What moves to the operating budget generally matches what's in the 5-year capital plan. It does not always. It is a planning document. We make changes. We staff made a change because there was discussion here, there was discussion in the Public Works Committee that said, oh, something, there's a difference now. So we go to page 167, and on that line item, it no longer shows anything to do with this underpass project for 2013, and it only put in 150,000 for Phase 1 in the 2014. The only budget, the only thing that the council approves is the 2013 budget, and obviously not this evening. But, and there is a zero in there for this project. No dollars have been identified. You can wipe out, if you would like, everything in the capital expenditure budget, and it frankly doesn't matter because you don't adopt it. It's a plan. So the plan is changed. It's reflected on page 167 in the 2013 budget with a zero for that project. So generally, you do not go back and change the capital expenditure budget because it's a plan at a point in time.
All right,
I'm sorry, just what line item were you talking about on page
I'm
167?
looking at street improvements, the 8025 line.
So there's not the dollars, the 1.999,
You can see on page CEB 10,
yep,
CEB 10, you see line 37, there's the 1,999,700. That matches line 8025 on page 167. You see the sidewalks are there, and that's a separate line item. The 235 that was on that line does not appear anyplace. So that's why I'm saying it's a zero in the 2013 budget. The other two projects are there. You don't see 235,000 unless you
It's not in there.
have a budget that we didn't deliver to you.
Alderman, wait, who we at? Alderman Morley? And
that doesn't make sense, though.
go ahead. You've got the floor, sir.
Thank you, Marilyn, for that excellent clarification. I think that answers my question.
All right.
Did this once before we got that.
Is there any other discussion? I will just chime in because I think I'm allowed to say something here in committee of the whole. I think that it could be done either way. You could look at it and say, well, it shouldn't be in the budget until we get further down the road, or you can put it in the budget and say it may not be there. But I also agree that it seems to suggest that there's something wrong with staff going out and putting in paperwork. I think we've all talked about telling them to get out there and apply for grants. This is a big grant, and I can't tell you today how I'm going to come down on this project either. I don't have any problem leaving it in there. It's a placeholder. It talks about something that's in a plan. It doesn't mean we're going to do it. It's not part of the budget. I probably confused things when I talked about the 235. It could be in, or it doesn't have to be in. It doesn't really matter because it's not in the budget this year. So everyone understands it, I think, now, I hope. And so Alderman Bram's motion is to strike the entire line 38. And I'll call for, I think we'll do a roll call on this one.
Okay, Bram,
Aye.
Hessa,
Aye.
Gudenkauf,
Sorry, we're voting,
To remove line 38 from the capital expenditure budget.
no.
Leader,
No.
Dunn, absent. Palumsky,
No.
York,
No.
Hipskin, absent. Healy,
No.
Levin,
No?
Kennedy,
No.
Morley,
No.
Wagner,
No.
Mulliner.
No.
Okay, I've got 10 ayes, 2 nays, and 2 absent.
Other way around.
I mean, thank you. All right, let me go back and do this again.
10 noes.
2 ayes, 10 nays, and 2 absent.
All right, the motion fails. We're back on to the main capital expenditure budget. if anyone has additional comment or questions on it. Alderman Pezza?
Just to clarify, in general, I would always encourage staff to go out for every possible grant out there. This isn't about seeking grants. And in the future, since I won't be here, I think it's important to remember that every year before our Public Affair and Safety Committee, both Chief Neubauer and the fire chief have always come before us before budget time and presented to us their plan, their needs, their wants, their thoughts, what they're seeking. So perhaps in the future, if Public Works has something like this, I would recommend, it's such a huge project, that be incorporated into that type of a presentation. Perhaps these types of things wouldn't happen this way.
Probably. Alderman Healy?
And as a counterpoint, I would remind everybody that that project was rated as an A-level project by staff, not by Director Hughes, not by City Manager Grabowski, by staff, of which Chief Ruth and Chief Bassador sit. Rated as an A-level project by staff.
Okay. Anything else on the capital expenditure budget? Let me look to where we're going. It's 10:20. I know we have a couple circle backs. Does the council want to, because I think if we we have two. Of course, that could be an hour, but, so I'll ask the council, is your sort of indication, do you want to continue through the circle backs? Okay.
A question.
Yes, Alderman Gutenkopf.
Thank you. What's our drop-dead date to approve the budget?
Well, we're not going to be discussing it on March 25th, is my understanding.
The drop-dead date is the second council meeting. It has to be approved at that, no later than the second council meeting, because the council cannot be convened for any other purpose except for the inauguration of new members after that night.
So we still have the opportunity on April 1st to continue this discussion.
We do.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
That's correct.
All right, well, it looks like the will of the staff is to continue, but the will of the council tonight supersedes, and their will is not to continue. So we'll entertain a motion to adjourn, and we will pick up with circle backs. Alderman Morley with the motion, Alderman York with the second. All in favor? Aye. Adjourn.